but congratulations to everybody for organising this conference. And thanks to everybody for the contributions they made yesterday, which enables me to summarise my paper in parts. Because I began by giving a summary of the teleological view of Irish history, which I think yesterday's discussions showed to be inadequate. First of all, the assumption that the Irish patriots of the 18th century, that their ideas were taken up by American revolutionaries, and to that degree that what developed in 18th century Ireland was a causal factor of the American Revolution. And the second factor that we treated at greater discussion yesterday was that the volunteers effectively were an equivalent of what was happening in North America at the same time, and again were a liberating force. So this version of events had been framed in the 19th century by publicists associated with the Nation newspaper, established in 1842. And if we had a PowerPoint working, I would show you a picture of Thomas Davis at this point, his dates being 1814 to 45. He was the leading intellectual behind the development of this movement, at least as far as the writing of history was concerned. And they communicated in prose, verse and ballad form, and they isolated what they considered to be the milestones that marked the evolution of an Irish nation over time. And they also were interested in developing contact with developments in Ireland in North America, and that Irish nationalism had to be represented as a liberal cause. Besides that, this writing on the 18th century dimension of the Irish national story, as far as the Young Irelanders were concerned, enabled them to bring the Irish Protestant population into the general narrative. Those who were the products of the plantations of the earlier centuries could now be seen to have been promoting the idea of an Irish nation. So this is very important to Davis himself, who came from a Protestant background. Davis and the other Young Ireland historians who wrote of these events in the 1840s accepted that whatever independence had been secured by Britain, by Ireland's political nation from Britain, had been made possible by the difficulties that Britain experienced because of the American Revolutionary War itself. They recognized that the preoccupation of Britain with conflict in America and at sea had placed Ireland's patriots in an unexpected position where they could demand and secure greater constitutional independence for the country, thereby leading to what became known as the Constitution of 1782, which was discussed yesterday. Now, the inadequacy of this argument was, Thomas McNevin, who was very closely associated with Davis, stated that there were strong analogies between the case of America and Ireland. The volunteer movement in Ireland, he professed, was the product of a new spirit inspired by the 1776 American declaration of war against old and obsolete opinions, systems and dispositions. So therefore, the volunteer movement was a product of what had happened in America in 1776, according to this version of events. Now, the inadequacy of that was demonstrated particularly by those who concentrated yesterday on the origins of the volunteer movement. But even as McNevin was writing, and McNevin revised his opinion the following year on the volunteers, but even as he was writing, the Young Irelanders were beginning to have doubt about the merit of praising the virtues of the volunteers, because they began to recognize that if the volunteers had stayed loyal to what their principles were supposed to be, then the 1798 rebellion would have been a success, because Protestant and Catholic were united. On the other hand, they recognized that many of those associated with the volunteers had associated with Orange during the 1798 rebellion, and thereby leading to the divided nation between Orange and Green that was a very vital factor of the country's characteristics in the 1840s. So therefore, in that sense, even Davis must have recognized that the argument he was pronouncing had some deficiencies within it, particularly as far as the volunteer movement was concerned. Now, as far as discrediting that argument, we got plenty of reasons why it should be discredited yesterday, but the person who first convinced me of the inadequacy of the argument was Vincent Morley. In his book, what I described here is a recent book, but in fact I see it was 2002. That Vincent Morley, in his book on Ireland and the American Revolution, I think many of you will have read it, but the important points that need to be summarised here is that, first of all, he was impressed by the extent to which all elements of the Irish population, I presume by that he would have meant all elements of the Irish literate population, were aware of what was happening in America during the course of the Revolutionary War. But on the other hand, he finds that while people were aware of events, that didn't necessarily mean that they were sympathetic with events or were sympathetic with the stance that the revolutionaries were taking. And he finds a clear division breaking down in denominational lines. And working as he did on the Gaelic Irish poetry of the time, he finds that opinion was that what was happening in America was, the conflict in America was essentially a conflict between two Protestant groups, one in Britain and the other in America, neither of whom was sympathetic to Catholicism, and therefore there was no benefit to be gained for Ireland from the struggle that was occurring in America at all. In that sense, it should be observers. Secondly, he pointed out that the Church of Ireland population, or particularly the gentry element, were concerned. Those who had been associated with the volunteers were essentially loyalists, and that when push came to shove in the Revolutionary War itself, insofar as they became involved, that they were fighting on the British side. So that in that sense that they were royalists and loyalists rather than people sympathetic to the revolutionary cause, even though they sympathized with some of the arguments that the revolutionaries were advancing and recognized how these could be used for their own benefit in improving their constitutional position at home. That didn't mean that they wanted of Ireland or America severing their connection with the British Crown. And that Morley pointed out that the group who were most keenly aware of what was happening in North America were the Ulster Presbyterian population, because of the large number of relatives that they had in America, because of the high level of literacy that are obtained within the communities on both sides of the Atlantic, and because of the correspondence which they sustained on both sides. And that these were the one element of Ireland's population who were actually seriously engaged in the revolution and seriously sympathetic to what was happening in North America. So that summarizes more or less the inadequacies which Vincent Morley identified in the received teleological version of events, which was gospel truth at the point when I was an undergraduate, and which has now been fairly comprehensively discredited. But Davis, as I pointed out, as I suggested already, must have had some misgivings about the argument which was so important to himself. And I think it is for that reason that he appears to have wanted to have the case of Ireland having an association with the American Revolution documented. So that one of Davis's contributions, as well as writing in the Nation newspaper itself, he also commissioned a series of volumes in what he called a Library of Ireland, which were to deal with the history of the elements of Ireland's history which weren't adequately understood and comprehended. And that these were to be published at a cheap print, and they were to be circulated widely, and they were to be used for the education of those of Ireland's population who were literate in the English language. And of the volumes which he commissioned, only one is on a subject other than Irish history itself, and that is a volume which he entitled A History of the American Revolution. And that the person that Davis commissioned to write this was a man called Michael Doheny. Again, if I had a slide, I would show you a picture of Doheny. Doheny was slightly older than Davis. He was born in 1805 and he lived till 1862. And that Doheny was commissioned by Davis to write this volume, and that he produced the volume in 1846, very quickly after he'd been commissioned to write it. But this was less than a year after Davis had died at the age of, in September 1845, at the age of 31. Doheny was already a known political figure, at least would have been known to Davis, and that he had written in the Nation newspaper. He had been active in the Tide War of the 1830s, and he had been active in supporting O'Connell for the repeal of the Act of Union throughout the 1840s. However, notwithstanding his support for repeal, Doheney had become an early critic of O'Connell, both because of O'Connell's refusal to condone rebellion as a means of furthering political objectives, and because O'Connell had supported the Catholic bishops in condemning the Queen's colleges in Belfast, Cork and Galway, because the Catholic bishops wanted instead a Catholic university to be established in Dublin as a rival to the Protestant Trinity College, and that the Young Irelanders generally were sympathetic towards the Queen's colleges, and indeed some of them found employment in those bodies. But as well as differing with O'Connell in such policy matters, Doheney also associated himself with the charge that O'Connell and his immediate associates had become corrupted by their links with the British establishment. These political positions that Doheney had adopted in his earlier career identified him as a firebrand among O'Connell's previous followers, and that O'Connell took to describing these people as Young Irelanders, thereby associating them with Young Italy and anti-Catholicism and anti-papacy particularly, and thereby discrediting them attempting to discredit them within the Irish political community itself, although I think the name today is regarded positively rather than negatively. If Doheney stood out as one of the more extreme of the Young Ireland group, he was unusual in the generally genteel company that we associated Young Irelanders, many of them, like Davis himself or Mitchell, graduates of Trinity College Dublin. In that Doheney came from South Tipperary. He was a farmer's son of pretty impecunious circumstances. He was largely self-educated, and he succeeded in drawing upon whatever educational resources were available to him in South Tipperary in order to gain admission to King's Inns, where he was enrolled as a barrister in 1838, so that he was a self-made man and had red hair and freckles, and therefore all of this seemed to make him stand apart from the altogether more properly dressed people like Davis and Mitchell. Davis probably selected Doheney for his American Revolution assignment because Doheney seems to have had existing contacts with the Irish community in exile in the United States, and because he had some understanding of American politics. That he had such contacts is suggested by his dedication of his book, The American Revolution, to Robert Tyler, the son of John Tyler, the 10th United States President, who had been president from 1841 to 1845. In his dedication, Doheney praised Robert Tyler for the links that he established with the Irish communities in Philadelphia and New York as he was attempting to create a Democratic Party machine. By the time Doheney himself becomes an exile in America, which he does in 1847, he established a legal practice in New York. He soon became involved in Democratic Party politics, and that he resumed a correspondence with Tyler, a correspondence I was able to consult because it's available online. The Tyler papers are available in the College of William and Mary. In his book, Doheney acknowledged that his general understanding of the American Revolution came from two sources. We can't imagine that he did deep archival work over the course of 1 year and produced a book called The History of the American Revolution. Instead of that, he read some secondary literature. And the two ones that he cites most frequently are the multi-volume History of the United States by George Bancroft, the early volumes of which had become available in print since 1834, and the biography of George Washington by the Frenchman Francois Guizot, which had become available in an English translation in 1840. These volumes provided Doheney with a general understanding, first of how Britain's mainland colonies had come into being in the first instance, Second, of how friction had developed between the British government and its colonial subjects in America. And following the conclusion of the 9 Years' War in 1763. And third, of how the conflict that developed between these colonists and the British government quickly shifted from being one of resistance to being one of revolution. And that Doheney supplemented the information that was available from these sources by knowledge which he built up himself, particularly about Irish participation in the American Revolutionary War, which was a matter which was of particular importance to him. But in writing the book, he had three objectives in mind. He was going to write a short book, whereas what he was drawing upon were multi-volume books. So he wanted to provide a general narrative of the principal events of the American Revolutionary War, which would be recognized as being appropriate and orthodox. Secondly, he wanted to build upon this narrative by dwelling upon the elements of the conflict that had Irish associations, because this was going to be the novel contribution that he was making. And third, and perhaps most important, he wanted to identify the impediments to recognizing and admitting an Irish participation in the conflict that was inherent within what Bancroft had written. In that sense, he wanted to criticize Bancroft as well as to draw upon the volumes which Bancroft had compiled, providing the narrative of the revolution itself. So therefore, his dependence upon Bancroft for his general narrative didn't prevent him from challenging that author's assumption. And that one of his principal insights was his conclusion, or that the surrender of Lord Cornwallis to the armies of the colonists and the French allies at Yorktown in October 1781, and even the Peace of Paris of 2 years later, that this didn't secure the independence of the United States. In fact, his general supposition was that the independence of America was not assured until after the War of 1812. So in other words, it was 1815 before the independence of America was secured. He certainly recognized that the Articles of Confederation were not a sufficient bonding mechanism for keeping the 13 independent states together. He recognized there was a constant danger that they were going to fall apart. There was always a danger that foreign powers would intrude upon them and exploit differences between them, and that it wasn't really until they had a new constitution, until the constitution had been ratified, and until they had proven their ability to defend themselves in war in the conflict of 1812, that it was not until then that the American Revolution had been secured. So that in that sense, he recognized that the immediate political consequences of the American victory was that 13 rebellious colonies had become 13 independent states. And he gave principal credit in the early stages of the conflict to the military successes of the colonists themselves, notably that of Horatio Gates over the British forces led by John Burgoyne at Saratoga in 1777, because this was what encouraged the French to become involved in the war, and he was again emphasizing that it was the French involvement in the war which made the ultimate victory possible. And then, as I said, he was doubtful if the Articles of Confederation were a sufficient guarantee for holding the 13 new states together, that it required a constitution which required to be ratified, and therefore, and ultimately, they had to prove themselves in war. But as he addressed the interconnections between Ireland and revolutionary America, Doheney gave considerable thought to the place of Boston and Massachusetts more generally in the revolutionary story, which had featured so prominently in Bancroft's account. Doheney conceded that Boston merchants were to the fore in resisting the impositions required under the Stamp Act of 1765, which he considered the primary cause of the Revolution. However, he insisted that Boston's merchants were not unique in resenting the contempt which British officials and troops had displayed towards all colonists, including even towards the continental troops that included the young George Washington, who had fought on the British side during the 7 Years' War. Therefore, Doheney dissented from Bancroft's opinion that revolutionary fervour had peaked in Boston and from there had spread outwards towards the other colonies. As a corrective, Doheney emphasised that it was the Continental Congress that had convened in Philadelphia in 1774, which had mobilised, financed and overseen the military force that had confronted the tyrannical British troops and their loyalist supporters. So in that sense, he wanted to de-emphasise the importance of Boston as the kernel of revolutionary fervour itself. As he reappraised the relative significance of happenings in Boston, Doheney conceded that the actions of a licentious soldiery had proved especially offensive to the deep religious enthusiasm that obtained in that city. However, he insisted that such enthusiasm had not actually caused the revolution to occur. To prove his point, he took Bancroft to task for treating the early 17th century settlement of New England as the seedbed from which American attachment to liberty had grown. This involved him in rejecting fundamentally what he described as the sentiment which recognizes in the singular austerity of the Puritans' faith the true, if not the only, impulse of American resistance. He insisted that Bancroft's assumption that the revolution was solely or even mainly owing to the character of influence of any particular form of faith was fundamentally flawed, because it was tantamount to claiming for the doctrines of the Reformation the only true guardianship of civil liberty. This was untrue, argued Doheney, because experience had shown how every form of Christian belief repudiates civil degradation and slavery, that the sincerer Catholicity, Protestantism or Puritanism is, the more securely may liberty rely on it. Experience had also shown, he claimed, that the perfection of civil liberty exalts and purifies any form of religion with which it is associated. The best proof that religion and liberty were complementary was, he claimed, to be found in the Revolutionary War, where men of every creed and every country fought for the cause of liberty. Doheney laboured his refutation of Bancroft on this point because he believed that what he considered the prejudices from which it derived were as entrenched in Britain and in Ireland as they were in America. He was particularly alarmed that the eloquence of Burke and Chatham, that is, Edmund Burke and William Pitt the Elder, had consecrated the sentiment which recognises that in the singular austerity of the Puritans' faith lay the true, if not the only, impulse of American resistance. Such a presumption, he contended, stemmed from the Protestant historical narrative that equated civil liberty with Protestantism and associated Catholicism with tyranny. Sober history, asserted Doheney, provided no such flattery of any religion, and especially not any religion whose followers had once identified themselves with the harshest elements of an intolerant civil code. Here Doheney may have had events in Cromwellian Ireland in mind, and he was certainly referring to the notoriously rigid regime that had prevailed in New England communities during the 17th and the 18th centuries. That had prescribed all who were not of them, and this in a covenant with which their daring sanctity made God a party. Doheney pronounced that his own investigation had found no fact to justify the assumption, highly sanctioned though it be, that the revolution was solely or even mainly owing to the character of influence of any particular form of faith. Instead, he was satisfied that resistance to British rule in the colonies was provoked by the passing by the British Parliament, without consultation with colonial assemblies, of a Stamp Act designed to raise revenue to help defray the cost of governing the colonies. This, he contended, was resented by the colonial assemblies in all of Britain's mainland colonies, who then, he argued, out of a sense of self-respect, had provided military and moral support to Massachusetts once that colony had been isolated for exemplary punishment by Britain. Doheney was thus convinced that resistance led quickly to a revolutionary situation in which colonists in all 13 mainland colonies, regardless of national origin or religious affiliation of their inhabitants, had joined forces to resist what they perceived to be the oppression of all the colonies by the British government. It was particularly important to Doheney to tease out this proposition because Bancroft's assumption allowed for no possibility that any Irish people, and particularly not any Irish Catholics, could be credited with having provided support for the cause of liberty in America, or indeed anywhere. To sustain his case, Doheney demonstrated how the struggle for liberty in America drew support from the Irish emigrant population, regardless of religious allegiance, in every mainland colony in which they had a presence. He mentioned that his original intention had been to group together in his book all Irishmen who had participated in the action. This he then recognized on mature thinking that would be disproportionate within a volume which was designed to give a general narrative of the Revolutionary War. Therefore, he limited himself to offering a short mention of the cause and course of the revolutionary process, which was little more than a modified distillation of the account that Bancroft had written. And then he interrupted his summary with short insertions describing what he regarded as the more Irish involvement in the revolution, in the process itself. To give some examples of this, when he referred to Bancroft's detailing the first English involvement in North America before the Mayflower crossing itself, that he recognized that this was long and boring and that it had been a long drawn-out process over the course of Queen Elizabeth's reign, indeed going back even to the reign of Henry VIII. And he interjected that it could not have been otherwise, since Queen Elizabeth had had little leisure to think of the fate of those to whom she gave the land of the Indians, so hotly pressed were the more favoured adventurers among whom she parcelled the green fields of the native Irish. In that sense, he was playing upon a trope which was quite familiar within the writings of Young Ireland's authors on history of Ireland itself. Later, as Doheney traced the early stages of revolutionary conflict in America, he provided exceptional detail in the Northern campaign conducted by General Richard Montgomery, who we heard of yesterday, that had led both to the death of the general as he stormed Quebec and to what he claims was the decision taken by the US Congress to commission a monument which would perpetuate the memory of Montgomery's heroic action. Doheney justified his lengthy treatment of this episode both because the assault of Quebec had been especially dramatic, but more particularly because Richard Montgomery was an Irishman. Doheney similarly interrupted his narrative to salute the accomplishments of other officers of Irish birth or origin, some of them Catholic, who had served in Washington's army. Then, possibly conscious that they were small in number, he augmented them by identifying officers of Irish origin who had played significant part in the War of 1812. These included John Barry from Wexford, who he saluted as the founder of the US Navy, and Andrew Jackson, who incorrectly stated had been born at sea when his father was en route from County Antrim to America. Jackson was in fact born 2 years after he had arrived there from Antrim. While Doheney thought it important to credit the part played by Irish officers in both wars, he also recognised the Irish who had served in the ranks. He claimed that the contribution made by Irish soldiers to the war effort of the Revolutionary Army was so consequential that British officers saw advantage in encouraging them to mutiny or to desert their posts. The British did so, he claimed, by displaying placards, acquainting the old countrymen that the affairs of Ireland were fully settled and that Great Britain and Ireland were united, as well from that interest as from affection. Doheney reported with some satisfaction that this ruse proved futile because the Irish soldier could remember nothing in connection with the English name save that it was a blight on the destiny of their country. Doheny also attempted to give identify Irish people who had served the United States in a civil capacity. These included Charles Thompson, who was Secretary to the First Continental Congress and effectively managed the administration of the new nation until George Washington became first president in 1789, and Charles Carroll of Carrollton, the sole Irish signatory of the U.S. Declaration of Independence. However, Doheny's history of the American Revolution remained primarily a narrative of what he described as a war of posts, by which he meant a struggle between the contestants to secure control of the military positions that had been established in strategic positions on the American mainland during the course of the 7 Years' War. He believed that colonists enjoyed an advantage over their opponents in this enterprise because of the superior knowledge of their natural environment. The result was, he claimed, that the American conflict became truly a guerrilla warfare, and he sustained this judgment by providing some accounts of colourful episodes in the struggle for control of particular posts. These vignettes proved interesting in themselves, but Doheny's further purpose was to illustrate how the success of the American colonists in securing liberty from Britain's tyrannical rule established a precedent that the oppressed population of Ireland might imitate if only they were prepared to make a bid for liberty. When this moment came, he pronounced, it would be the duty of every upright citizen to know the advantages, whether military, commercial or social, of every post in the country. As Irish people familiarised themselves with such positions, they would be doing no more than was standard practice in England, where people, he contended, were encouraged to know of the strategic positions in their country as a precaution against the emergence of a new Napoleon. In the light of this English practice, Doheny considered perverse that the British authorities in Ireland, out of a living and stinging sense of England's part that the wrong she had done us must sooner or later be avenged, had placed obstacles in the way of people comprehending what it is becoming in a free man to know. The consequence for Ireland, he claimed, was that the citizen is a slave and the government despotism. Doheny's remedy for this situation is that the Irish people should take a lesson from the former American colonists and should thoroughly understand and know how to make use of their country's capacity for a military struggle. As Doheny thus treated as exemplary the means by which the former colonists in America had achieved freedom from Britain, he remained conscious, as I already mentioned, that they had initially secured their position in each of the 13 colonies at the expense of the native population, just as British settlers in Ireland had displaced the indigenous population in order to become the proprietors there. He passed quickly over such inconvenient parallels because his purpose was to demonstrate how the colonists in America had succeeded in their struggle with Britain, after which he hoped to show how the rhetoric and tactics they had employed in doing so provided a template that would-be revolutionaries in Ireland might follow. Another inconvenient truth of which Doheny was conscious was that Washington and many of the American revolutionary leaders were slave owners from the southern states and were in this respect enemies of liberty. The same still held true at the time he was writing, and slave owner politicians included Robert Tyler, to whom Doheny dedicated his history, and with whom he opened a correspondence once he himself had settled in the United States. This correspondence flourished during the course of the presidential election of 1856, when Doheny undertook to mobilize Irish and German voters in New York State on behalf of the Democratic Party. In so doing, he was supplementing the work of Tyler, who was managing the campaign of James Buchanan, the Democratic candidate, who would become the 15th President of the United States in 1857. Doheny's association with Tyler and the presence of slave owners as a significant component with the Democratic Party occasioned Doheny some soul-searching. He resolved this dilemma to his satisfaction by arguing in his letters that the issues that divided the Democrats from the Republicans was not, as was being stated by friend and foe alike, a question between slavery and freedom. Had it been so, claimed Doheney, he would, at all risks, be at the side of freedom. However, Doheney appealed to Tyler to expose the hollowness and the heartlessness of the anti-slavery cant of the Republican opponents. Doheney believed that if Tyler succeeded in doing so, it would help him to secure the votes of a very large minority of the Irish voters and also some German voters in New York State, who seemed intent on voting for Jean Frémont, the Republican candidate, because they thought the issue was slavery or freedom. It's such overtures assuaged Doheney's misgivings concerning his association with slave owners. He was more troubled concerning a speech that Buchanan had given in London that appeared to justify British rule in India and in Ireland. This speech aroused such alarm within what Tyler termed the Irish faction within the Democratic Party that Tyler saw the need to write to the editor of the Irish Citizen to assure Irish voters that Buchanan shared their concern over Britain's mismanagement of Ireland. Doheney was also impressed that Tyler, in an effort to recover his own credibility, as well as that of Buchanan with Irish voters, had addressed the Robert Emmet Club at Cincinnati some weeks following Buchanan's London speech. Such persistent concerns of Doheney make it clear that while his history of the American Revolution was a genuine attempt by him to understand why some subjects of the Crown and colonial British America sought to break free from British control, and then to make their ambition a reality, the fact remains that his mind was fixed always on events in Ireland and how what had happened in Ireland might serve Ireland's cause. What Doheney wrote indicates also that its author was among the first of the Young Ireland group to conclude that Ireland's difficulties would only be resolved when Irish people took example from patriots in 18th century America and launched a guerrilla campaign to gain independence from Britain. He, as we know, was among the Young Ireland group who conspired to put their ideas into practice in a revolution that this Young Ireland faction planned for 1848. This projected revolution, as well known, fizzled out for a variety of reasons, especially so because the conspirators many of the conspirators had been arrested before the date which had been scheduled for action had taken place, and the leadership was further weakened because others, including Doheney, eluded their would-be captors by fleeing to the United States to evade arrest. We have no means of knowing how Thomas Davis, had he lived, would have responded to this turn of events in 1847 and 1848. However, there can be no doubt that Davis would have been satisfied that Doheney had fulfilled his commission to which he had assigned him. Davis would have been particularly pleased that Doheney had challenged the fundamental premise of what today we refer to as Whig or progressive history, whether written in Britain, Ireland or America, that equated Protestantism with liberty and Catholicism with tyranny, given that Davis himself had similarly challenged that connection when writing of the Irish Parliament of 1689. There, Davis had argued, however implausibly, that the libertarian arguments associated with Ireland's Protestant patriots, William Molyneux, Jonathan Swift and Charles Lucas, had been inspired not, as Protestants would have it, by the principles underlying the glorious revolution of 1689-90, but rather the legislation proposed in Ireland's Jacobite Parliament of 1689, a predominantly Catholic assembly. It was this line of argument that justified Davis's pronouncement that the idea that had motivated the members of the exclusively Protestant 1782 Parliament to seek for greater autonomy from Britain was to be found full-grown in 1689. Davis would also have been impressed by Doheney's demonstration that in America, as in Ireland, tyrannical actions by the British authorities had driven peace-abiding subjects of the Crown to become patriots dedicated to upholding the rights of their oppressed community. He would also have taken satisfaction in Doheney's contention that the same vocabulary of dissent that had been employed by Irish 18th century patriots to confront peremptory government actions had been adopted by the American patriots when they in turn had challenged the tyranny of British government. When Doheney asserted that the arguments and tactics of Irish patriots had in some way influenced the thinking and actions of disgruntled American colonists, a claim that we now know to be untrue, he was doing no more than endorsing opinions that Davis held dear. On military matters, Davis would likely have been satisfied with the evidence produced by Doheney that people of Irish birth and lineage in America, regardless of denominational affiliation or social position, had become supporters of the revolutionary cause. Moreover, Doheney's account of the bravery displayed by the Irish who had fought to achieve independence for the oppressed colonists in America comprehended what Davis himself had narrated in verse concerning the daring deeds of the Irish wild geese fighting against Britain in the armies of France and Spain after they had been expelled from Ireland because they had opposed William of Orange. That Doheney was consciously pointing to a continuity of military service by Irish soldiers to serve just causes was made clear by him in 1849 when he dedicated his better known and largely autobiographical book, The Felon's Track, to General James Shields, a native of County Tyrone. As he did so, Doheney admitted that he had never met Shields, but that he knew of and admired his service in the US Army during the Mexican-American War of 1846-48, where Shields had demonstrated that he, an Irishman, had done even better than the illustrious exiles who had become soldiers of fortune in the service of a foreign prince, whose actions had been lauded in verse by Davis. The service of Shields was more remarkable, according to Doheney, because he was a citizen of this free republic and a volunteer in its ranks. And his example, claimed Davis, provided an encouraging augury for those who cherished the ambition of realizing for Ireland an independent destiny. Doheney's History of the American Revolution clearly justified its inclusion within the Library of Ireland series because its author made a strong case that the two wars, the American Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, that he considered necessary to securing the independence of the United States, was as much a part of the history of the Irish abroad as were the fighting endeavours of Irish exiles in the 18th century conflicts of the European mainland that Davis brought into the mainstream of Ireland's history. However, had he known of more recent conflict on the American Revolution, that concerning the Irish in North America during the revolutionary years, Doheney would have been in a position to make a stronger case than he actually did about the interconnection between events in Ireland and North America. We can see with the benefit of hindsight that the principal weakness in Doheney's composition was that he clung too closely to Bancroft's narrative, with the result that he gave most attention in his narrative to the battle pieces that were fought along the East Coast rather than giving more attention to the conflict along the frontier, which, as we know from Patrick Griffin's work, was the area where most Irish people were involved, and that these were Ulster Protestants who had settled close to the frontier and who used their ambition to gain control of Native American lands as a pretext for attacking the Redcoats who held the frontier positions that were supposed to defend the Native Americans from their attack. Similarly, recent scholarship has endorsed the opinion of Doheney that the success of the revolution in America did not become secure until after the War of 1812 came to an end. And various authors have also upheld Doheney's proposition that the true scale of the Irish contribution of the revolution's success can be appreciated only when account is taken of the course of events between 1783 and 1815. The historian Alan Taylor has written on both of these subjects. He has shown that the Ulster Presbyterian element of Americans' population and immigrants from Ireland, Catholic and Protestant, who flowed into the country in increasing numbers in the decades following the Revolutionary War, seemed more committed to American independence than many native-born Americans. Taylor has been able to do this most effectively in his reconstruction of the War of 1812, which he depicts as a civil war because some of the existing American elites, especially in Upper New York State, seem more ready to negotiate terms with the British rather than have their estates seized or destroyed by British forces, or worse still, by having them taken over by Native American allies who were allies to the British forces and who would descend upon them from Canada. Taylor also thinks it possible that the reluctance of the elites to confront opposing forces in defense of their nascent independent confederation could have led to the collapse of the United States, were it not for the large number of recently arrived immigrant groups, including large numbers of Irish who enlisted in the United States Army more enthusiastically than did native-born Americans. The readiness of the Irish and other immigrants to become volunteers in the US Army may be attributed in part to their straitened economic circumstances. However, Taylor recognises also that many of the Irish who rallied to the cause, or at least their leaders, had been committed Republicans before they ever reached America and cherished their new home as a place in which they could, in exile, realise the dream that had been impossible for them to bring into being at home. Such Irish Republicans had first become a conspicuous presence in America in the years previous to the 1798 rebellion in Ireland, when some suspected subversive fled from Ireland to America, sometimes via France, to escape arrest by government agents. Their numbers were augmented in the aftermath of the 1798 rebellion, and yet another group found refuge in America after the further rebellion of 1803 led by Robert Emmet, once this proved abortive. These Irish Republican immigrants became a conspicuous presence in Philadelphia and New York, which city bases became involved with radicalizing politics of the states of Pennsylvania and New York. Alan Taylor has been able to supplement his own research in this subject with what has been written by Maurice Brick, David Wilson, and Rowan O'Donnell. Thanks to such studies, we know more than Doheny acknowledged or was aware that when American voters were called upon to ratify their constitution, these Irish radicals played a major role in promoting Republican candidates in the states of Pennsylvania and New York to challenge more conservative representatives whose principal concern was to uphold the rights of property and to reduce foreign influences over United States politics. The more conservative elements were particularly fearful of ideas associated with the French Revolution in its radical phase, which they believed were being imported into the United States by Irish Republicans. To halt this process, the conservative elements challenged the granting of votes to people of modest means, especially Irish immigrants. For example, one Federalist propagandist pronounced that as well might we attempt to tame the hyena as to Americanize an Irishman. One consequence of the failure to curb immigration was that the continued activity of Irish Republicans in US politics during the early years of independence helped to ensure that the broadly based definition of republicanism expounded by Thomas Jefferson, third president between 1801 and 1809, prevailed over the elitist view. Irish influences of another kind can also be seen to have prevailed when Jefferson encouraged the long-standing ambition of Ulster Protestants to expand the frontiers of the United States westwards into lands previously controlled by Native Americans. The extent to which populism associated with such populism came into prominence in American politics may be due to interconnections between politics in Ireland and North America during the era of revolution. It's seldom stated and not acknowledged, and it was not acknowledged in so many words by Michael Doheny. However, Doheny did insist that the full extent of the Irish military contribution to the achievement and security of independence for the United States could only be appreciated when account was taken of the participation of Irish soldiers in the War of 1812 as well as in the Revolutionary War. His own experience of seeking asylum in the United States rather than in France after being forced to flee the country because he had been identified by the government as a subversive, and the ease which he became involved in United States politics is proof that he found New York a congenial second home. What held true for Doheney was especially true, equally true of other young Ireland asylum seekers who, like the political refugees from 1798 and 1803, found refuge in the United States, some like John Mitchell after they'd escaped from penal colonies in Australia. As a settler in America, they would, from reading Doheney's History of the American Revolution, have learned something of the part that Irish people had played in shaping a new republic that they had been prevented from doing in the land of their birth. This study of interconnections between Ireland and North America during the Age of Revolution has been viewed largely through the eyes of Michael Doheney, both because he was a witness to the process of revolution in both countries, and because, in my opinion, the history of the American Revolution, which receives scant attention today, is a remarkably incisive work that identified research paths and questions that historians are only recently taking up. This is not to say that the work was without blemish, and he, like many of his contemporaries in young Ireland, could be faulted for many presumptions which were unjustified. On the other hand, it is to his credit that he, unlike many of his contemporaries and successors who took an interest in the topic, accepted that the part that Irish people, and particularly Irish leaders, played in the American Revolutionary War was modest. Instead of exaggerating, as others did, the part played by Irish soldiers in the American war effort, Doheney argued persuasively that the more significant contribution made by Irish people to securing the independence of the United States was during the War of 1812. This opinion, as I said, has been endorsed by recent scholars, and Doheney can also be considered precocious in considering that the revolutionary process in America was played out over a prolonged period that extended from 1760 to at least 1815, and that neither the independence of the United States nor the social and political shape of the new order had been fully completed by 1783. The principal shortcoming of Doheney's history is the extent to which he derived his narrative almost exclusively from Bancroft. However, Doheney did break from his guide most significantly in charging Bancroft being excessively New England-centric and theologically bound. In this too, Doheney anticipated much that would later be written about the American Revolution. While such virtues in Doheney's account assist our understanding of interconnection between Ireland and America during the Revolutionary era, the real merit of his work is that he himself was a revolutionary with an interest in and experience of a revolution in both countries. Earlier generations of Irish revolutions had done as Doheney did by escaping from Ireland to America before they had been arrested there, and many Irish journalists and publicists had acted similarly. One of the more fertile scholarly streams of recent years has been devoted to explaining how Irish political refugees who were given a safe home in America in the 1790s and again in the first decade of the 19th century brought European political ideas with them and worked in their new situation to keep America on the revolutionary path. This means effectively preventing the benefits of the independence that had been gained from Britain becoming the exclusive property of an existing property elite within the United States. This earlier generation of revolutions hoped, no doubt, to use the resources they had at their command in the United States to reignite revolutionary fervour in Ireland should opportunity so arise. However, none such happened, while ultra-conservative forces in Ireland and Britain remained alert to stifling any dissent in either country during the decades following the French Revolution. The possibility of promoting revolution in Ireland were hardly greater in the 1840s when Doheney entered upon his enforced exile. However, circumstances were then different within the United States. because now the cities had become home to an ever-increasing pauperized Irish community in exile who blamed their dislocation and their misfortune on British mismanagement of Ireland. These and the Irish journalists who flourished in their midst were prepared to offer their moral and financial support to whatever harebrained schemes to weaken British rule in Ireland were hatched up by Republican dissidents such as Doheny. Such revolutionaries, while earning a living and raising families in the United States, continued to regret the chance they believed had been squandered in 1848 to establish Ireland as an independent republic. However, they never abandoned their search for a scheme to weaken from a distance what they considered to be the stranglehold that the British authorities held over an Irish population, who they believed would readily embrace republicanism if only the chains were loosened that held them to a foreign power. Thus, while one consequence of the interaction that were established between Republicans in Ireland and America during the era of revolution was the endeavour of Irish Republican dissidents to keep the revolutionary spirit alive in the United States during the early decades of that new nation. Another was the effort of future generations of Irish Republican dissidents to use the United States as a springboard from which to launch revolutionary sallies into Ireland with a view to ending British control over the country. So thank you.